make him an offer he can't refuse.
I have a feeling we're not in Kansas anymore.
Stuff that dreams are made of.
Gentlemen, you can't fight in here. This is the war room.
One morning, I shot an elephant in my pajamas. How he got in my pajamas, I don't know.
I am big. It's the pictures that got small.
Go ahead. Make my day.
I'm sorry, Dave. I'm afraid I can't do that.
Frankly, my dear, I don't give a damn.
Hello and welcome to Front Row Classics, a production of the Front Row network of shows, where we take a look at some of the greatest films ever made. And here's your host, Brandon Davis.
Well, hello to everybody out there in podcast land. This is Front Row Classics with NPR Illinois Community Voices. I'm your host, Brandon Davis, and today I have a very special interview to share with you. As you know, it's Veterans Day today, and this interview goes right along with that topic and that holiday. So first of all, thank you to all of you veterans who have served over the years at home, abroad, anywhere. There's a brand new book out from Turner Classic Movies and Running Press called Hollywood Victory, The Movies, Stars, and Stories of World War II. And I get to speak to the author on the book, Christian Blauvelt, who is the managing editor of IndieWire. He's been seen on various TV shows, podcasts over the years discussing classic film. He's worked for Entertainment Weekly and several other outlets. And it was a real treat to get to speak with him about this book. He's a wide range of knowledge about this. It's my favorite era of filmmaking. It's his favorite era of filmmaking. So we really get to delve in deep into the personalities and the films and the events of the time. We cover so much, everything from studios who wanted to dip their toes into dealing with the war, those who didn't, and then of course once Pearl Harbor happens, everyone jumps in with feet first in doing movies that are either propaganda for the war, or even if they aren't war related, it still has a cloud over all those films. And we talk about all the different stars that went into the military. We talk about everything about the home front, things like the Hollywood Canteen. And we also talk about how, surprisingly inclusive and diverse the war years are in Hollywood, and how for some reason once the war ended we sort of regressed, and it took us another decade or two to really get back to that. So it's a really, really interesting conversation, and I think that you'll really enjoy it and really want to buy the book after we talk about some of these topics. So let's jump right in, and here is my interview with Christian Blauvelt. And it is my absolute pleasure to welcome Christian Blauvelt to Front Row Classics. Welcome, Christian.
Brandon, thank you so much for having me. It's great to be here.
Wonderful, wonderful. I read the book, and I got to tell you, first of all, it's my favorite era of Hollywood history. And
Mine as well. Mine as well, as you might have been able to tell.
It's everything like I've ever wanted condensed into a book, and it's fantastic, and I'm really, really excited. There's so much to talk about in such a short amount of time, but we'll cover as much as possible.
That's great. I love it. Yeah, the 40s are by far my favorite movie decade, so this was such a natural fit for me to write this book, and I'm so excited that it's your favorite decade, your favorite time in Hollywood too. Yes,
so many great movies, so many wonderful characters behind the scenes, and we'll talk about that. But first of all, just since this is the first time I've had you on the show, just a little bit about yourself. How did you get into writing about film?
Well, I always knew really since high school that I wanted to be an entertainment journalist. I studied film studies when I was in college. I went to Northwestern, then I really wanted to get a job at Entertainment Weekly. And I so lucked out in getting an internship there right after I graduated in 2008, and have been employed in the film and TV journalism world ever since. I was at EW for 4 years. I was at a place called Hollywood.com for a while. I was the deputy editor at BBC Culture for 5 years. And now it's been over 3 years as managing editor of IndieWire.
That's great. That's great. So how did this project come to be?
Well, I had written a previous book for TCM and Running Press, an imprint of the Hachette Book Group. called Cinematic Cities, New York, which was basically a history of New York City on the big screen, a neighborhood by neighborhood look at, just how the Big Apple has been portrayed in movies. And it was like sort of like you could use it as a travel guide. You're holding it and looking at it while walking around the city and going through different neighborhoods and seeing landmarks. And, oh, so that was in this movie. Oh, that was in that movie, And so that was a lot of fun to write that book. And then that just led naturally into writing this Hollywood Victory because, I love the period so much. I sold Running Press and TCM on the idea by showing this little short film that would have played in theaters during the war, where Betty Davis has these like two little child actors playing her children, trying to, and it's Christmas morning, and she tells them, kids, your Christmas present this year, war bonds. And that left such an impression. It's actually a little filler that they would always put on TCM during the holiday season. They may well again this year, for all I know. And it was like, this whole period is so rich and interesting and rewarding and has so many quirky little details. It lends itself perfectly to a book. And I think they found that it was a subject that was really worth exploring themselves because, TCM has so many of these films in their library. So, it was a really natural fit, and they were sold very quickly.
Yeah, you mentioned that, and I love whenever I'm watching a Golden Age movie, and at the end it'll say, buy your war bonds in this theater or something like that. It's such a cool detail to find.
That's right. I mean, that's the amazing thing. That was the power of movies at that time, because the average American went to the movies twice a week, which is incredible. Movie theaters, across the country were often open 24/7 because people who had taken jobs in the wartime industries and factories, often had shifts at all hours of the day. They get out of, their job at like 2 a.m, then they can go see a 2:30 screening of a movie. It's really incredible, that level of impact that movies had, including what you just mentioned, that you could actually buy war bonds at your movie theater. You go see a movie and then you pay a little extra, get a war bond. You're going to get that back with nominal interest after the war. But, it's like that's a little way that actually by going to the movies, you can really contribute to the war effort.
Yeah, and it's one of the major things I get out of the book is, the war, it permeated throughout Hollywood, throughout those years before and after the war even. And looking at the years before the war, though, you mentioned in the book, about the whole isolationism period in Hollywood when some studios dipped their toes in the water, some studios didn't at all. And little by little, you had these dissenters like Marlene Dietrich and Edward G. Robinson, and it was a period where people kind of tiptoed around it.
That's right. And some of those, like Edward G. Robinson, who had been so active in the Hollywood Anti-Nazi League in the 30s, then after the war, were accused of being prematurely anti-fascist. Maybe that means that, they had communist sympathies, perhaps. And so some of those types would get in trouble after the war, end up being blacklisted, running afoul of the House of Un-American Activities Committee. That was definitely the case with Edward G. Robinson. But yeah, there were a few voices who were really in the 30s trying to, make it known throughout Hollywood, hey, we got to wake up to this, what's happening in Germany is going to affect us. We can't just ignore this. What's happening in Japan, that and across Asia as a result of the Japanese conquests. I mean, that's going to come and affect us someday. And, it's like we can say all we want that we don't want to get into another war, which was the prevailing view by far across America. It was like, in the late 30s, like even after Kristallnacht, I think it was still like 87% of the American public wanted to avoid ever getting into another war. The wounds of World War I were just so deep and so fresh. It was that there were these few foresighted people who knew, we're probably going to get into this no matter what, whether we want to or not.
Yeah, and well, it's funny, and you were mentioning, the whole blacklisting aspect of that, and you even mentioned in the book that James Cagney came close, and that's what almost inspired him to do Yankee Doodle Dandy, correct?
That's right. Yeah, he appeared on a list of like, here's a list of Hollywood communists, and this was like right at the end of the 30s. That's part of the reason, in general, why so many in Hollywood, what Pearl Harbor happened and America did enter the war, so many I think threw themselves into patriotic films and war themed movies with such gusto was to claim a kind of moral high ground that they had been denied, I think, for a long time. Because, there were already sort of communist witch hunts happening in Hollywood during the 30s. There were also, like, the Catholic Legion of Decency was excoriating all kinds of films and filmmakers and actors for what they thought were indecent movies. And so there was all this scrutiny in the late 1930s coming from different authorities across the country, including in Washington D.C., different Senate committees, House committees, that were really investigating what was going on in Hollywood. And people in Hollywood wanted to show, hey, we're loyal Americans, we love this country, and we're not going to let you tell us who we are. We're going to take control of our own narrative. Someone like James Cagney, then, he's on that list of suspected communists. He's like, hey, I'm going to make the most patriotic movie ever made. He literally said to his brother, I think it's the Cohan picture. And so, he made Yankee Doodle Dandy. And by the end of that movie, he's literally, we're seeing him just as Cohan did, dressed up as FDR in the Broadway musical, I'd Rather Be Right. And so he's actually like playing FDR by the end. And then, of course, in the movie, he meets FDR. And it's delightful. But, it's like that's the kind of pivot that I think a lot of people in Hollywood felt that they had to make. It was, ultimately, the war was very good for just improving the reputation of many in Hollywood.
And and it's almost as if, had the war not happened, the whole Red Scare would have happened a decade earlier.
Probably. Yeah. I mean, there on one of those lists, we mentioned Cagney, but the witch hunts were so extreme already at that point that even 10-year-old Shirley Temple appeared on one. Man. So that was the level of, it would have happened a decade earlier. You're absolutely right.
That is nuts. Well, one of the early pre-war films that always strikes me that you mentioned in the book is The Mortal Storm, and I recently watched it again because it was part of the TCM Film Festival on HBO Max, and so it's a movie that I think has just improved over time. I mean, it's a scary movie, and it really holds up, and it really, man, does it predict what was coming.
Yeah, it absolutely does, because it's about the lives of people in Germany in, the lead up to in the very early days of the Third Reich, 1932, 1933, and about how quickly a society that initially prides itself as being open and tolerant and free thinking and modern can descend into something so completely rejecting of all those things, and into real barbarism, people turning on one another and throwing each other in concentration camps. And that film is really remarkable because there'd been some, anti-Nazi statements by Hollywood up to that point, but they were more just like, this is the Nazi ideology. It's horrible. These people are villains. All true. Absolutely right. Mortal Storm, I think, is so powerful because it's the first to really empathize with the victims of Nazism and really make you realize, wow, this is what they're doing. Finally, we're not just like, we're not just focusing on their barbarism in the abstract. We're focusing on it in really human terms. So it's Jimmy Stewart and Margaret Sullivan, same year as their romantic pairing in Shop Around the Corner. And, he's like a Tyrolean mountain climbing lad, hates the Nazis, opposes them. She is the daughter of, or at least the stepdaughter of, a Jewish professor. He's never really identified as Jewish per se until a key moment when when we see him in a concentration camp, and he's wearing an armband that has a J on it. And now he is Jewish. It's very subtle. It's not, something that's really articulated too much throughout the film, because certainly anti-Semitism was widespread in the US as well. So I think there was a real reluctance on the part of a lot of filmmakers and studios to really identify the Nazis' victims as being Jewish. There was a real reluctance to do that in some ways, but in that moment with the J, who he is, what his background is, and what's happening to him is such a grave injustice, because you've come to love that character. He's played by Frank Morgan, who's the Wizard in The Wizard of Oz,
and he's fantastic in it.
So good in that. And he has that wonderful little speech at the beginning before the Nazis take over. It's his birthday, and he's like, we in this family pride ourselves on our tolerance and our good sense of humor. And those things unfortunately don't last, because several of his own stepchildren become Nazis, and it's a very sad and really heartbreaking movie, but in its own way, quite beautiful, because of the empathy that it has for the victims of this horrible regime.
And coming from a studio like MGM, which seemed to completely ignore what was going on in the early days of the war, and almost it's like Louis B. Mayer went from wanting to ignore it altogether to being the loudest voice in dissent of Nazism.
Isn't that amazing?
Yeah.
I mean, because just a couple years earlier, he had still been submitting scripts for MGM movies to Georg Gisling, who was the Nazi German consul in LA. He was the guy who would basically look at scripts for Hollywood movies and see if they would pass muster with Germany at that time. And Louis B. Mayer was on board with that whole vetting process and everything. And I think it was just, it was partially a financial incentive. I mean, Germany was the biggest foreign market for Hollywood. Definitely the largest, the most financially lucrative of any foreign market. But also there was a real, there was a worry among the Jewish studio heads that if they made any really explicit anti-Nazi statements, that it could make life worse for Jewish people living in Nazi Germany, or in the lands that eventually they would conquer. And then finally, there was just a real desire to assimilate on their part and not identify their Jewish background too explicitly. So it was like not making a big stink about Nazism was part of that desire to assimilate. So it was all those different things. And eventually they woke up and realized, we've got to confront this.
And I love the story that you tell in the book about Louis B. Mayer wanting the Nazi in Mrs. Miniver to not be too evil, and then Weiler had to fight back.
That's right. And it was like initially, it's like, oh well, we can't make this Nazi flyer. So if you've ever seen Mrs. Miniver, there's a great scene where the title character, played by Greer Garson, she's home alone, and she lives in this bucolic countryside house, in Surrey, in England, and her husband is away. She's all alone. And there's a Nazi flyer whose plane has been shot down nearby. People are looking for him. He shows up at her house. He holds her at gunpoint. He wants her to feed him. And played actually by Helmut Dantin, who is he's briefly in Casablanca. He's the Bulgarian guy who's at the roulette table. Visas and all. Yeah, he's great in that too. But, played by Helmut Dantin. And so eventually, his real evil shines through in that scene. Like he brags about how they killed tens of thousands of people in Rotterdam. And it's like the real barbarous nature of the Nazi regime comes through him. And initially it was like Louis B. Mayer was like, maybe we shouldn't be taking sides here too much. Maybe we should just be dealing with this as like war of the abstract. Maybe we should not, be acting like that this Nazi flyer is that evil, that he's like one of, Hitler's little madmen. And then what happens like the next day or so, like literally while they're shooting that scene, Pearl Harbor happens. And then it's like, okay, actually, you know what? William Wyler, you were right. Let's make him purely evil. I take it all back. And so he did ultimately come across as one of Hitler's little madmen. And it's a very effective scene. Ultimately, Mrs. Miniver slaps him. That was something that was even like a point of contention initially.
And that's a great movie. I love Mrs. Miniver. Greer Garson is one of those actresses that seems to be, she was a huge star during the war years, and then of course kind of faded once the war ended. But that string of movies she made during the war years is fantastic. I love Random Harvest.
Yeah, absolutely. Random Harvest is great. Yeah, so many good ones there. I mean, of course, Mrs. Miniver even had a sequel some years later.
Oh yeah.
No, she's terrific. She appeared on TV a good bit in the 50s. Fans of the Yuletide perennial, the little drummer
boy. Yeah.
He narrates that. No, she's terrific. Yeah, one of my favorites.
Yeah. One of the things I love about the book is we've had a lot of books. I think specifically like about Five Came Back, which talks about a lot, which is a wonderful book, which talks about what happened on the front lines. But I love that you really delve a lot into the home front as well in this movie, in this book, and and just about how certain events affected people here on the home front, and certainly one of the Pearl Harbor certainly was the driving force, but it feels like the death of Carol Lombard was another driving force in bringing the war home for people.
That brought a reality to the war to so many, especially to those in Hollywood. One of their own suddenly is a casualty of the war. She had just been on this nationwide war bonds fundraising tour, raised a ton of money, including in her home state of Indiana. And she, then hurries back to Los Angeles, something maybe because she suspected that her husband, Clark Gable, was having an affair with Lana Turner. And so she felt this real desire to hurry back to LA. And, at that time, there were no direct flights like between Indianapolis and Los Angeles. Right. So we're talking like 4 different legs or so you'd have to take to get back. And on the last leg from Las Vegas to LA, she and the whole plane crashed into Mount Potosi, which is on the outskirts of Las Vegas. All were killed. And this is only like 6 weeks after Pearl Harbor. This is January 16th, 1942. And this was just a shocking, just a rattling event for Hollywood. They had the Oscars coming up, in just a few weeks after that, and they've lost one of their own. Her last movie, To Be or Not to Be, many consider her best. Ernst Lubitsch directing, great comedy. Jack Benny, amazing satire of the Nazis. That was a posthumous release. That came out after she died, and it was it's the kind of moment that it's hard to think of many equivalents to it today, but you think of the death of maybe back for that moment it would have been like the death of Chadwick Boseman or the death of Paul Walker or any of these shocking deaths that just you don't expect it to ever happen.
Such a bright light that was snuffed out, because you think of what else we could have gotten from her.
It's true, absolutely, and then it set Clark Gable on such a different path. He was just devastated by his grief, and joined the Army Air Forces, became a gunner on a B-17. Flew 6 missions over occupied Europe, and actually took some amazing color documentary footage. He actually had a camera up there as well, and ultimately turned that footage into a documentary called Combat America, which is a remarkable color portrait of the war. And but he was never the same after that. He had been the king of Hollywood. There was this story about how he always had this chair this grand chair, like at the head of a table at the MGM commissary, where he was their biggest star. He made like, $3,500 a week, which was like the most of anyone in Hollywood at that time. Yeah. And, they put that chair sort of, they laid it like on the table so that no one else could sit there until he returned. And so when he came back after the war, after flying all those missions, everyone knowing what he'd been through with the loss of his wife, he got to sit in that chair again, and it was like the king had returned. And it was a really powerful moment.
And this, of course, I'm really fascinated by reading about, all of the different actors that served in the military during that time, and, certain lengths that studios went to maybe, not get them drafted, not get them into the military. And of course, Jimmy Stewart, being, probably the most decorated of them all.
Exactly. That, he was so foresighted in that he joined up 9 months before Pearl Harbor. That's how much he knew that the war was coming. And to be fair, others saw it coming too, but not everyone joined up 9 months before, So he joined up, he joined the Army as a private, like in March of 1941. And by the time Pearl Harbor happened, I think he was only a corporal, and, he then was able to qualify for the Army Air Forces. Back then the Air Force was not a separate branch. But, being a flyer, which is what he really wanted to do, he did have some flying experience. That was not something that, like, he was 32 at the time. And normally I think the cutoff for admittance into the Army Air Forces was like 26. So but that's what he really wanted to do. And he rose through the ranks. He ended up flying like 23, 24 missions over Europe, like major bombing missions, piloting sometimes himself, other times like commanding not only his own plane, but multiple other planes. Like by the time like D-Day happened, he was commanding hundreds of men. And, he ended the war as a colonel. He stayed in the Army Reserve, or the Air Force Reserve, and did, his whole career, as in the reserves, like during the Vietnam era, as a brigadier general. It's one of the most amazing ascensions really ever, like from private to brigadier general ultimately. I mean, when he's in the reserves, he's not actually, he's in the reserves, but but during the war itself, like he ended the war as a colonel and was commanding hundreds of men. So it's very impressive.
Yeah. And you have, and of course you have other actors like, Henry Fonda, Robert Taylor, and then you have the ones who stayed behind and, played soldiers in the movies like John Wayne or Robert Walker, actors like that. And of course they were doing their part for the war effort on screen.
Yeah, exactly. John Wayne, it seems like he just kept asking for deferral after deferral. And, he kept saying to people that he was going to join up. John Ford, his friend and, his best director, the guy who directed him in Stagecoach and so many classics, I think always held that against Wayne for the rest of his life, that he did not actually join up. I think Wayne was just really terrified that his career was going to take a hit. And there are stories about him going on like USO tours and entertaining the troops, visiting troops and everything. And then like weirdly wanting to sort of play act like he was at war. Like he actually like tried to take over like, the bomb site of a plane that he was flying in when they were like going on a sort of a mission. And he was like, I want to go, see where the action is. And so there was always, I think with Wayne, this feeling that he'd missed out. And I think that definitely plays into his heightened macho persona, the play acting nature of that. And
I always wondered if he overcompensated for that later in life.
That's what it is. It was an overcompensation, the extreme jingoism and, of his later years, being so pro the Vietnam War and American and that and everything. It's a lot of overcompensation for his guilt, I think, for what happened earlier. But yeah, I mean, a lot, as you said, I mean, the studios really helped some of the actors. They didn't want to go into the service, stay out of it. Like, Louis B. Mayer pulled so many strings to not, to make sure that like Mickey Rooney wouldn't end up in the military. I think actually Mickey Rooney was probably more willing to go than Louis B. Mayer was to have him go, and he actually did, like Mickey Rooney actually did ultimately win like a Bronze Star for his, putting himself in harm's way to entertain the troops. He was in uniform ultimately, but he was in sort of like the Army entertainment unit. And, but, that meant like being on the front lines basically. So, it's a really fascinating thing. I mean, those who, didn't want to go because they were worried about their career, or maybe just couldn't go because they had health issues, like Gregory Peck, or Errol Flynn for that matter. It's a real, and what that means about like their identity formation. How do they see themselves after that? How does the world see them? It's really interesting.
Yeah. Well, and Mickey Rooney, of course, appears in one of my favorite World War II era movies, which is The Human Comedy.
One of the absolute best. I think the best home front movie ever made, really. The best American set home front movie ever made. It's such a beautiful film. I love that. That's one of your favorites as well?
Oh, he is phenomenal in it. I don't think he ever gets credit for how good of an actor he was.
Completely agree. No, I think so that came out in 1943. I think he should have won Best Actor for that. He was nominated for Best Actor at the Oscars. It was Paul Lucas, who is also great for Watching the Rhine, who won that year. But Mickey Rooney, that is a wonderful movie, and if and such a beautiful progressive vision of America as well. There's this, it was written by William Saroyan. And, definitely has like a very kind of progressive spirit to it. There's this whole scene where Marsha Hunt and her boyfriend are driving through this park, and they see all these different like ethnic communities. Here's an Armenian festival. Here's all these different, and it's like they're all being celebrated for their differences and for the fact that they're all Americans. And that's such a beautiful thing, like recognizing our diversity, celebrating our differences, and seeing what connects us as well. And that's a message that we could use a lot more today, frankly.
Absolutely. I need to go watch it again now. Speaking of the home front, though, one of my favorite sections of the book, and it's a subject that has always fascinated me, and it's the Hollywood Canteen. To think that, just putting myself back in that era, to think that these legendary people would make themselves so accessible to servicemen. Let's talk a little bit about the Hollywood Canteen now.
If this wasn't a reason to join up and find yourself in uniform, I don't know what else, it's like, this is
to be able to dance with Rita Hayworth. Yeah.
Be able to dance with Rita Hayworth, be able to dance with Betty Grable or, Marlena Dietrich or Hedy Lamarr. It's the most amazing thing. So anyway, the Hollywood Canteen was a nightclub set up by Betty Davis and John Garfield right in the heart of Hollywood. And it was a place where anyone in uniform, men and women, could come and, see their favorite movie stars put on live entertainment, could actually dance with them. Could be served like coffee and donuts by them, or meals. Gary Cooper could be in the kitchen cooking you a meal. Rita Hayworth could be the coat check girl. Lana Turner could come by and like pour you coffee or something. It was a nightclub where you could interact with all of your favorite stars, all of Hollywood's biggest stars, as like just a wonderful morale boosting thing when, for those people in uniform who were going to be shipped off to somewhere in the Pacific, because Los Angeles was a huge kind of like transit waypoint for, service people heading to the Pacific. And it's the most remarkable thing. I think it's one of the coolest ways of democratizing Hollywood that I can think of bringing Hollywood to you. And the fact that it went off without a hitch, really. There were a few scandals attached to it, but but the rules that were in place, I think, were largely respected. Like, if you're there as Hollywood talent, you only like give one dance to, each person, like, you don't have a second dance, you don't like exchange personal information, and everybody seemed to really respect this. Now, Betty Davis apparently did have an affair with one of the with one of the soldiers there, but it's one of these things that it's like it was desegregated. People of all racial backgrounds were there together. Some people objected to this, like John Ford's wife, actually.
Yes.
She did object to this and was like, calling the LAPD to like report incidents. And I love that, the LAPD actually did reach out to John Ford, who was off, who knows where at that point, probably in London or something, doing his own wartime documentary work. And he was like, if she has such a problem with this, just like take her out of the club, take her outside, let her cool off. Like he was more progressive on racial issues than she was. So he didn't really have time for this and thought that she was just being ridiculous. But the fact that it was desegregated and that, women could enjoy it as well. And, you could finally, you could see like Errol Flynn up close. You could see Gary Cooper up close. It's the most amazing thing.
To have been alive back then. It just and you mentioned Betty Davis even said it's one of the few things that she was really, really proud of when she looked back.
Yeah, she considered it the greatest achievement of her career. And I can see why. I mean, it's something just so singular that you can only imagine just the sheer number of people, who were given comfort and succor and hope and a bit of joy, just, when they were about to go off and face such uncertainty. Yeah. It's a really beautiful thing.
Well, and speaking of the Hollywood Canteen being desegregated, there's another section in your book where you talk about looking back on World War II. It's surprisingly diverse and inclusive, more than people would think. And of course, it was the dawn of a lot of African-American themed films like Cabin in the Sky and Stormy Weather.
That's exactly right. There had been some all-black films or films with all-black casts produced by major Hollywood studios before this. There was MGM's musical Hallelujah in 1929 with, that King Vidor directed. But Hollywood's approach to inclusivity was certainly intermittent then, as it has been ever since in many respects. But it was during World War II that they really felt an impetus to reach out to the African-American audience in a way that they had not really before, to make the African-American audience feel like that they were included in the American project, that we're all in this together and we all need to fight this war together. And how can you expect Black Americans to fight this war if they are being systematically denied their rights and not being included in the idea of America? Mm-hmm. So, what's unique about Cabin in the Sky and Stormy Weather is that since they are all Black casts, it's like these are films that are not about like the white gaze. It's not about Black people as seen by white people necessarily. It's not about them existing in relation to white people. It's about them, living. It's about celebrating Black excellence on its own terms,
right,
and not as mediated by white people. And you see a film like Cabin in the Sky. It's a really miraculous thing because it's the MGM Dream Factory opened up, to an all African-American cast. There's something really beautiful about it. And, that's all that being said, of course, the performers in these films still had monumental challenges to overcome. I mean, Lena Horne, who's in both of those movies, initially at MGM, and then I believe even at 20th Century Fox, where she made Stormy Weather, there were people in the makeup and hair departments who didn't want to work on her hair, who didn't want to touch her hair at all. It's very, and that's very depressing and really, really sad. She ultimately, in the years ahead, would basically abandon Hollywood because she realized that she had no opportunities there. Mm-hmm. Because unfortunately, this whole window of inclusivity during the war years was very brief. And progress in any form, but certainly in Hollywood, as as in American life at large, is not a straight line. It's there are many. Whenever there's a step forward, there are several steps taken back, and so whatever was achieved during the war years with inclusivity in that regard took such a backward step after the war years. And I think in a way, like the kind of vision that you have of what a more inclusive Hollywood could have been during World War II, with the films with all African-American casts, with the outreach to Latin America and the rise to prominence of some Latin American stars like Carmen Miranda, and the different roles that you have for women during this time, more professional roles on screen that women are inhabiting. A lot of those things, do point the way toward what Hollywood would ultimately become, but it would just take a very long time to ultimately get there. And I think that in many ways, like when people love, the new Hollywood of the 70s, some of the roots of that are in the 40s. Some of the roots of the discussions that we have today about inclusivity are definitely discussions that were being had at that time. Someone like Anna May Wong, who really helped make a couple of really interesting films about China's struggle against Japan. She basically had to find her own projects by the time World War II came around, because she wasn't getting the kind of roles that she wanted. Like she wanted the lead role in The Good Earth, but that would mean that she would be cast opposite a white actor, and with anti-miscegenation rules of the code, that wasn't going to be allowed. So basically, she, as an actual Chinese American woman, could only just play like a small supporting part in this movie about Chinese life, when a white woman would be playing the lead Chinese, the Chinese female lead character. And, it's very upsetting, but a lot of those issues about whitewashing and, who gets what opportunities. I mean, they were having those conversations in the 30s and 40s, and we're having those conversations now.
Yeah, and it makes me think about the sections where you talk about, you have these actors who had escaped, Nazi Germany playing Nazis in these movies, and then you have these Chinese actors playing these Japanese characters, and sort of the yin and yang of all of that, and how odd it must have been.
Isn't that fascinating? Yeah, I mean, I mentioned Helmut Dantine earlier. Helmut Dantine in real life had been in a concentration camp. He had actually been in one. He had lived in Vienna, and after the Anschluss, the events where Germany took over Austria in 1938, he found himself in a concentration camp because he had been spreading some anti-Nazi views. And his father was like a wealthy industrialist, though, so managed to get him out of there and send him to study at UCLA, and that put him on a path to eventually being in movies. But it's fascinating when you see some of those actors who are playing Nazis. They'd had some remarkable stories themselves. Conrad Veidt, one of the legendary figures of German cinema, going back to 1919 in The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, considered some to be like the first horror movie. He had to leave Germany because he was married to a Jewish wife, and he came to Hollywood eventually after a pit stop in Britain, and ends up playing, the fiendish Major Strasser in Casablanca. And, there's so many stories like that. People who had been persecuted or found themselves on the run from the Nazis, then having to play Nazis just because they have the accent. And, but it was hard for those people. I mean, even if you were a refugee from the Nazis, just the fact that you had come from Germany or Austria meant that in Hollywood at that time, in Los Angeles, like, the government considered you an enemy alien. So you had to abide by like an 8 p.m. curfew. You could not be seen after dark, like after 8 p.m., because you were considered an enemy alien, even though you were one of their victims. It's a remarkable thing. Well,
and talking about Casablanca, I mean, to me, one of the greatest movie scenes of all is the La Marseillaise scene, where, of course, reading about that, knowing that a lot of those extras were refugees in that scene, and so that adds to the emotional weight of that scene, and I think that's what makes that movie a miracle.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, that Casablanca is such an interesting case study in how representation matters, because most of the people in that film are not American. In fact, there are only like 3 American actors in the whole movie. It's Humphrey Bogart, Dooley Wilson, and then also the girl who plays the wife of Helmut Dantine,
Yeah.
the Bulgarian girl. I forget her name at the moment, but she was like the daughter of like a studio head or something, and so she was cast in that. But like everybody else is non-American, and most of them, had fled the Nazis in one way or another, or had fled some form of persecution. And I like Billy Wilder years later said that, wow, it must have been, so moving for all of these people, to be cast in that film, because it must have been like, reuniting, at Potsdamer Platz or something. Like it must have been like, like you felt like you were back in the old country in a way, because you're just around people who had, you had known probably a lot from the industry back home, but also just, you'd all been through this shared sense of struggle together. And, that to me is really moving. I mean, yeah, all the Nazi characters in Casablanca, they had all been victims of the Nazis themselves, one way or another. They had all fled. And and so many others, even like, the Russian guy who's like the barman who like kisses Rick at one point, like he had fled Russia like during the Russian Revolution, 24 years earlier or whatever.
Yeah.
It was like, so many amazing stories like that.
You mentioned the South America, and the good neighbor policy always interests me. And one of the big figures of that was Walt Disney, and Disney was going through interesting stuff during the war years.
Oh, very much so. Yeah. So before Pearl Harbor, the summer of 1941, there'd been a huge animators strike. About half of his studio, I think he had about 600 people working for him at that point. About half of them went on strike, low wages. I mean, like a lot of people working for Disney at that time were only making like, $10 or $15 a week. Some of the top animators would make more like $350 a week. So there was a real disparity. They went on strike, and Walt's approach to this ultimately was to accept this government contract to take a trip to South America, like just to fly away and not have to deal with the strike. And, he went on this tour of, he took like 18 animators with him, went to Brazil, Argentina, Chile, up into Peru. And it was really important because those countries were very much considering joining the Axis. There was, Nazi Germany was certainly making a lot of overtures to them. And Disney ultimately made a couple films out of that trip, Saludos Amigos and The Three Caballeros. Which are great. I highly recommend them.
They're a lot of fun.
They're really fun. And, so many of the artists on that trip ended up being inspired by what they saw in South America, like Mary Blair, one of the true Disney legends, really developed her aesthetic, I think, on that trip. There's so many ways that you can see her work. Once you really like notice the Mary Blair style, it's like you can't unsee it. It's like you see it like everywhere. Like she's the one who ultimately developed all the kids for It's a Small World at the parks, and she did like this whole sort of like mosaic thing at the Contemporary Resort at Disney World. And yeah, she has a very specific aesthetic. But that whole period was so formative for Disney because it at first really brought him into the government sphere, so to speak, which helped him out financially, which he needed. He had that strike to resolve. Eventually that was resolved.
Well, and Pinocchio and Bambi and Fantasia lost money, right?
They all bombed. Exactly. Yeah. The only one that was a hit in the early 40s was Dumbo. Man. And all those other films bombed. They were hugely expensive. He had just sunk all of the money that he had made from Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs into this huge, sprawling Burbank campus, which is still the Disney headquarters today. And, he needed money. So the government really helped out with that. Once the war started, he took all these government contracts to make training films. And, but there was like the day after Pearl Harbor, Walt's production head called him up and said, Walt, the Army is moving in on us. Because actually it turns out like 800 Army anti-aircraft gunners ended up being garrisoned at the Disney Burbank campus, just in case there should be an invasion or some kind of aerial attack that could be there to respond. The fact that they were in Burbank meant that they weren't quite as close to, Hollywood, so it wouldn't cause a panic to have them stationed there. But that's the only studio during the war that was like forced to actually accommodate troops. And then by the end of the war years, he had gotten himself out of his debt, and he had really gone a long way with his films and his ties to the government and everything to becoming almost this kind of, father figure for the nation. It's pretty amazing.
Yeah. And another aspect, of course, is the whole entertaining the troops, which we think of, and of course the central figure that we think of is Bob Hope, and this was the start of many years of him entertaining the troops.
Oh, so many. I have this one of his last. One of the last things he did before he died in the early 2000s was with his daughter release this joke book. It was like I think it's actually called Bob Hope: My Life in Jokes. And it's so useful just to see how his style basically stayed the same throughout his entire career. I love just opening that up because there's something about Bob Hope that is so endearing because his jokes are so lame in a way, but that actually is what makes them great. It's like, he'd have a joke like, Ferdinand the Bull, didn't clean up at the Oscars. That's because Walt Disney gave him a bum steer. And I just love that. It's like actually one of my favorite jokes of his. But no, I mean, he developed his reputation for, going so far out of his way into, entertaining the troops and going to far-flung places to find them and put on some entertainment and fun for them. I actually do think there might have been a little mercenary element to that initially, which is just that he had a captive audience who were desperate for entertainment and would laugh at anything he would do or say. But he clearly fell in love with that and ended up doing it, through the Gulf War in the 90s.
Yeah, and there's, I love watching old footage of that, or him, performing for troops on the radio, and you have him bringing on Judy Garland to sing Over the Rainbow and things like that. I mean, just what a time that was.
What a time. I mean, at the end of, it's not even truly the end of his life. He still had like 10 years to go, but he even sort of parodied himself, voicing himself on The Simpsons, like around 1990 or so. Where he was, portrayed at a USO show, brings on Lisa Simpson, and he says, hey boys, here's what you're fighting for if there was a war on.
Oh, gee.
That's like that's exactly what he would say if he was Garland or
Well, and then speaking of, bringing a little bit of home to the troops overseas, and of course with the holidays coming up, the song White Christmas played a big part during the war years, and you tell a wonderful story about how that came to be, and of course with Irving Berlin being a Jewish immigrant to the U.S.
Yeah, absolutely. He knew right away when he wrote that song. I think it's believed that he wrote it like in January of 1940. That's I think, I don't know if anyone knows that for certain, but that's widely believed, I think, is when he actually put it to paper. And he knew right away, this is like the greatest song of all time. I think he said something like, this isn't just the best song I ever wrote, it's the greatest song anyone ever wrote. And he was right. I mean, it's the best-selling song of all time. I mean, it's like we, in promoting Hollywood Victory and promoting the book here, I was, thinking about like where, what would be some good publications to run excerpts from it. And I realized, the White Christmas chapter, it has to go to Billboard because, they'll love this because this is, Billboard is all about charts and like, what's on the Hot 100 and all this. I mean, in White Christmas, not only did it go to the number one on the Billboard charts, it went to number one, so many other times over the years and is the best-selling song of all time. And, so much so, and it was so popular so quickly that like the initial recording that Bing Crosby made in 1942 actually the recording cylinder like had devolved within like 5 years. So in 1947, he had to go back and re-record it. And so it's very interesting. There are two different versions, and you can find them both on YouTube. There's the 1942 version, which is the one that everyone during the war years would have heard. And
from Holiday Inn.
Yeah, it's a little different. A little different because so he recorded that for Holiday Inn separately, even still. But there's like the actual like single version that would have aired on the radio. Okay. And that's the one that like he had to go back and re-record eventually. But it's interesting to hear the difference. Like in 42, he has like a little warble in there at the beginning. In 47, his voice has gotten a little bit more mature and a little bit more mellow sounding even. But no, I mean, it's an incredible song. And, Irving Berlin, I mean, this is a kid who grew up in Siberia. He grew up in this little town called Tyumen. And it's he's witnessed at a very young age, a pogrom against the Jewish community there that he was a part of, and his house being burned to the ground. It might have been, and often it was often on Christian holidays that the people of Russia would go on these pogroms against their Jewish neighbors. It might well have been on Christmas Day that he saw his home being burned to the ground as a small child. And years later, he would go on to give the world the greatest Christmas song of all time.
That's a great story. And before we wrap up here, Christian, just wanted to ask a couple more questions. As the war wraps up and ends, you mentioned in the book, it's almost like people kind of wanted to forget war life, because you said the only sort of military themed movie that does well post-war is Anchors Away right away. And then, of course, we get The Best Years of Our Lives, which really is the first time American audiences see on film sort of the impact that Coming Home from War has. And that's one of the great movies of all time.
It is. The actual term post-traumatic stress disorder wasn't actually coined until like 1978. It's not something that there was a specific term for, but that movie is about that. It's about dealing with the trauma that you've been through, and how do you then get back to normal life. That movie was a huge hit, The Best Years of Our Lives, because I think it did just so directly tap into what people were feeling in terms of how do we form a new life? How do we move on and act like that this just didn't happen? And so I think that's the reason why that film was such a success, even though a lot of the other movies that were still explicitly about the war that had been released around that time, like They Were Expendable or The Story of G.I. Joe, those films bombed. But this film, I think just it was about like what's next, and that was deeply resonant. You would think that something like It's a Wonderful Life, the perennial Christmas favorite, would have to some extent tapped into that too, but weirdly enough that did not connect with audiences at that time. So It's a Wonderful Life really was not a success when that came out in 1946, but The Best Years of Our Lives really was, and deservedly. It's a great movie.
Yeah. Christian, as we get close to wrapping up here, what's the legacy of Hollywood and its impact on World War II?
The World War II years enshrined movies once and for all as the definitive American art form. And I think in many ways enshrined movie making as America's great export industry to the rest of the world. It's so interesting. You begin the war years with Hollywood being at a precarious moment, with people, all these committees in Washington investigating the industry, people like James Cagney, like we mentioned, feeling like they had to really prove their bona fides as patriotic Americans. And by the end, there really wasn't any more question about that. Of course, in the years after, you'd have the blacklist and everything, but by that point, it was like the blacklist was happening in part just because people knew how powerful movies were. Mm-hmm. And the idea that movies had such power was now something that could never be questioned again, at least that. And I think that you see echoes of the World War II years in which Hollywood was willing to really confront the issues of the day, not shy away from them, be a little bit more political, be a little bit more confrontational, have greater opportunities and roles for women and for Black actors and and actors of Latino descent, Latin American outreach, all of those things that we've talked about. You see echoes of that in so many of the elements of Hollywood that have been praised ever since. You see that in the new Hollywood of the 70s. You see that in a lot of the discussions that we're having today about having a more inclusive, more engaged Hollywood. It's a much more fragmented industry today, and yet some of those discussions are still happening. And I think that when you hear some of those discussions happening today, you have to think, actually, these are some of the discussions we've been having since World War II, and it's a time that I think of World War II as, and everyone who fought it and everyone who helped win it for the Allies, and they gave birth to the world that we've known ever since, and we've lived in ever since. And you can't, experience like almost any aspect of our lives today without realizing that it's been touched in some way by those experiences, by the experiences of World War II.
Wonderful. And it's really interesting about how, you think every war since, this is really the only war you can think of where Hollywood and the American, especially middle America, were on the same page for once. Yeah. And, since then, it's totally been disjointed. But
very much so. Yeah. It's an interesting thing. Someone was asking me, I did this event the other night for the National Archives. It was sort of a launch event for the book. And someone asked during that, were there any movies that were like anti-war or pacifist or were saying that we shouldn't be involved in World War II? No, there weren't. And I think it's partly just because the battle lines were so clearly drawn,
Yeah.
Good and evil were so clearly defined. But, very quickly after the war, you see some of the more pacifist elements come to the fore once again, like, Rita Hayworth strongly objected to having her image be painted on the atomic bomb that was exploded at Bikini Atoll in 1946. She was really upset about that because she felt she didn't want to be associated with an instrument of destruction like that. And the idea, of course, by putting her on that was like, this is a literal bombshell now. She is a literal bombshell. But it's like, that's really interesting because now that's sort of the beginning of the anti-war streak that's been in Hollywood ever since. And that's completely fair. That's absolutely fair. But it's just a fascinating moment in time where I think World War II was just a time where everyone got, after all that isolationism in the 30s, got on board and realized that this is a war that did need to be fought. Nazis did need to be defeated. And, I think they would be shocked to see, 80 years later now that, my God, we have, people carrying tiki torches, like shouting Nazi, slogans in Charlottesville in 2017. And some of these things that have happened ever since, is like, how is it that it seems like we're doomed to face some of these same things again? I think it would be a real shock, because it's like, I think with all the wars ever since, it's been like, yeah, there are differences of opinion, reasons to get involved or not get involved in Vietnam. That's perfectly fine. Those points of discussion and debate, all the other wars as well. But with World War II, it was like, no, Nazis are bad. Nazis need to be fought. Yeah. Nazis need to be defeated. And to see that, there is a section of the American public today that seems to be kind of flirting with, Nazism to an extent, however small that segment of the population may be, is really shocking. But we only need to remember that in the 30s, there actually were a lot of American Nazis. There actually was a rally at Madison Square Garden. for the American Nazi Party, where like 25,000 American Nazis showed up in 1939. So if we remember that, it's like maybe what we're going through in this particular moment isn't as much of an anomaly. Maybe it actually does have some continuity with what came before. And some ideologies, no matter how toxic, just persist, and we need to keep on fighting them. And I hope that this book will inspire people to realize that when you see horrible things happening, horrible ideologies, hateful ideologies being spread, you can stand up to them. Hollywood didn't want to originally; they ultimately did, and that's something that can really inspire us.
And I'm sure glad they did. Christian, one last question: Is there an unknown or lesser known movie from this era that you would recommend people go and see?
Oh yes, there's so many really, but I would say The Man I Married, which is this 20th Century Fox movie with Joan Bennett and Francis Lederer, is really interesting. What if you are, a normal American career woman, and you just realize that the man that you're married to actually has Nazi sympathies and ultimately becomes a huge Nazi. That's a really interesting thing. It's one of the most overtly pro-divorce movies made in Hollywood. I think that's extremely interesting. I think a war movie that I showed on TCM the other night called Edge of Darkness, Errol Flynn and Ann Sheridan, is really worth watching. It's great. A lot of times when you think of war movies, you think of just like a bunch of guys with guns, on a mission. But this is great because actually there's a woman, Ann Sheridan, fighting alongside the guys. She's, holding a machine gun and mowing down Nazis in a hail of gunfire, just like the guys. And I think that's a really remarkable thing to see. So Edge of Darkness, I recommend. The Man I Married, I recommend. And there's so many others. You just basically pick up like Hollywood Victory, and most of the films that are in there, I recommend.
Well, and another movie with women at the forefront, So Proudly We Hail, with Claudette Colbert, Veronica Lake, and Paulette Goddard.
That's right. That's right. And Four Jills in a Jeep as well, based on the real life adventures of Carol Landis and Martha Ray entertaining the troops. Yeah, I mean, it was a great time for women on screen. I mean, just the images of women, really doing things and being active and, just being allowed on screen to do more, than just be there, to look pretty or be subordinate to the male character or sidekick to the male character in some way, be defined by the male character in some way. No, during this era, that was rarely the case. I mean, these are characters with agency and yet another way in which I think we can draw inspiration from that time and find echoes of discussions that we're having in the present moment.
Yeah, absolutely. Christian, this has been wonderful getting to speak with you. And if anybody wants to find you on social media or any place else, where can they find you?
Please, you can find me on Twitter at CT Blauvelt. That's CTBLAUVELT. On Instagram at just my name, Christian Blauvelt. And, by day, I'm the managing editor of IndieWire. So please check us out at IndieWire.com.
Fantastic. Fantastic. Christian, thank you so much.
Oh, it's my pleasure, Brandon.
I so appreciate Christian and his time speaking with me. It was a real treat because I think he and I are both pretty passionate about these films and this era of filmmaking, and I hope we have him on again very soon because I think that he brings a very interesting perspective and knowledge to this kind of discussion. Hope you enjoyed it too. The book, like I mentioned, is called Hollywood Victory, The Movie Stars Stories of World War II. And on this Veterans Day, if you have time, or maybe this weekend, find your favorite streaming service and find a film from this era and go back and watch it just to remember the sacrifice and the all-out not enthusiasm, but all out, just participation Hollywood had during this time, and about how the war just defined everything that Hollywood did during these years. And uh, everything was so united at that time, and it's really sad that we're living in a time where we're not. And maybe look back and remember this. And also, let me just dedicate this episode to, as I mentioned before, anyone who has served in the military. Thank you for your service. And I really would like to dedicate this episode to the members of that generation that we discussed today for fighting that war and defeating that evil, so that we could live in the world that we do today. It's not perfect, but they certainly helped us, keep evil away from the door. And so, once again, this has been a wonderful, wonderful interview, and I thank you all for listening. You can find us on Instagram at FRN Classics Pod, on Twitter at FRN Classics. You can email us at classicsfrn@gmail.com if you want to request a movie or something that you want to hear discussed. Eric and I love hearing your feedback. You can also find us on Facebook at Front Row Classics Podcast. So any of those outlets. So we would love to hear from you. And for this episode of Front Row Classics, I am Brandon Davis, and we will see you in the front row.